Hello and welcome to Coffee and Control, the podcast where I find fascinating people from within the world of control and convince them to answer all of my questions. I'm your host, Lucy Hodgins, and my guest today is an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia and the host of the fabulous podcast, inControl. So, as you might expect, I was a huge fan of him from listening to his podcast, and I emailed him about 6 months ago, essentially asking for tips on podcasting, and he was so lovely. He gave me some great advice and we kept in touch, and he very kindly agreed for me to interview him at the European Control Conference back in June. I was very nervous, but it was such a good interview. We ended up talking for nearly 2 hours, so I've decided to split our discussion in half, make this into a two-parter. You are in for a treat. It's going to come as a surprise to no one that Alberto was super eloquent and amazing at explaining things. So this episode covers a lot of very technical mathematical concepts in a very lovely kind of high level intuitive way. However, if you would like to delve deeper into the maths, which is extremely interesting, I've left a ton of resources in the description that you might want to go and look at. So get ready to hear all about moments of systems, model order reduction via moment matching, dominance margins, the role of creativity in control theory, and why nonlinear control is so fascinating, with my guest this month, Dr. Alberto Padoan.
I'm Alberto Padoan. I'm an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. My research these days lies, mostly in data-driven control, although my past has spanned different directions, biological applications, nonlinear control, if we go back in history. And yeah, I'm happy to be here.
I'm very happy to have you here. So the first question that I tend to ask all of my guests, I guess you do as well, is kind of how do you get interested in control?
Well, I think it was a fascination for a general theory of everything. The fun fact is that I've never been particularly skilled in mathematics and physics, or at least until university. And I was fascinated by this fact that somehow this discipline, when I first saw it, applied to every physical system that we could know or model. That was certainly fascinating. I should probably say that I had classical studies before university, and so, as I said, my first year through university in engineering was pretty hard, actually. But somehow, there was one professor, Andrea Marson, I really want to mention his name because we should give credit to these mentors, managed to spark some interest for me in mathematics, and from that day on, or from the day I attended his lectures, everything clicked somehow. I started loving the subject and then loving physics as well. And when I first saw this theory of control, I was like, couldn't stop.
So moving on to your master's thesis. So I saw you did your master's project on zero interlacing pole systems. So kind of how did this come about? Where did that topic come from?
Sure. I hope this doesn't sound insulting or disrespectful to Alessandro, who may or may not listen to this episode. But I was studying at the University of Padua in my last year, actually in my second to last year, and there was this Erasmus program that allowed students to travel. I always wanted to travel, and I actually wanted to learn English. So I saw the opportunity of going to London, and there was this exchange program with Imperial College London, so I applied. In the meantime, I actually had a course on advanced topics, quote unquote, on nonlinear control, delivered by Sandro Zampieri at the University of Padua. Another inspiration for me, because it was teaching us the rudiments, the fundamentals of geometric control. And that was the first time I saw Lie brackets. So, how with a nonlinear system, you could actually, for example, in parallel parking or in other application, you could reach directions that normally you wouldn't be able to reach, let's say, if you were to control the system in a straight line. And I hope I'm making sense. And so this kind of reinforced my enthusiasm for going to London, because it turned out that actually Alessandro Stoffi was an expert on nonlinear control, so I was super enthusiastic. And I ended up in at Imperial. Love my time there. I think London is a wonderful place, especially for a young person. Lots of things to do, lots of museums, very nice environment.
Sorry to interrupt Alberto here, but I wanted to add 2 points very quickly. So firstly, I can confirm that London is great, and especially the Science Museum. There were many occasions when I was a kid that my parents had to drag me out because I insisted on inspecting every single exhibit in great detail. 10 out of 10 would recommend. Secondly, Alberto briefly mentioned Lie brackets here and the fact that for nonlinear systems, it's possible to control the system to reach directions that you might not expect to be able to, with the classical example being parallel parking. And I wanted to point people in the direction of an inControl episode that Alberto made recently on controllability and observability. I'm expecting a lot of people have probably already listened to it. If you haven't, it's fantastic. Like, it explains these concepts so well, but also goes so much further, including a bunch of really cool applications. Honestly, it was great. Anyway, now back to the work that Alberto did in London during his master's.
Yeah, we were working on, during my master thesis, on moment matching. So I think at the time, Alessandro basically just developed this method of model reduction by moment matching for nonlinear systems. That was the novelty, using tools from output regulation theory and, classical tools, but applied to a different problem. And so we worked on essentially using those ideas to a specific class of systems called ZIP systems, zeros interlacing pole systems, that, to give an example, are basically representing ladders of RLC circuits, passive RLC circuits, or you can make a mechanical analogy as well. We were trying to understand whether this method actually preserved that structure, or under what conditions the structure was preserved. And yeah, I ended up loving Imperial College so much that, when I got an offer from Alessandro to stay, I couldn't say no.
Okay, so you kind of mentioned model matching. So you have done a bit of model matching using balancing, and that was something that I talked about in my episode with Paolo Rapisada. But I believe in your master's thesis you used a slightly different approach to model reduction. So could you kind of explain about that?
Sure. So these are essentially the two main ways, as to the best of my knowledge, of doing model reduction today. So you have on the one side so-called balancing. Balancing draws from ideas of, let's say the Diapun of ideas, whereby you also obtain bounds on the approximation that you make about the system. So maybe if we take a step back, the model reduction problem is, given a system, I'm trying to construct an approximate model that somehow resembles the original one. So mathematically, this can be posed as an approximation problem. For linear systems, this means that we have a transfer function or a transfer matrix, and we want to approximate it by another transfer function, another transfer matrix. Typically, this means that you would like either the norm of the difference of these two objects to be small, or at least, as in moment matching, that the two objects coincide at certain points in the complex plane. So, in fact, model reduction by moment matching is an approximation method that essentially is done via interpolation. So you make sure that the two functions coincide at certain points, given that these are two functions in the complex plane. It's funny that I started from the latter. So I started from model reduction by moment matching. I built quite a bit of expertise on the subject. And then during my postdoc, I guess maybe we'll talk about it later, I used the other type of approach for completely different purposes. So I really studied the model reduction problem at length.
For kind of listeners who might not be aware, what is the moment of a system? How would you define that?
Yeah, sure. So moments have a very long history. Moments have been studied by very illustrious mathematicians. Stieltjes is one of them. I could think of many others. Moment is essentially, if we think about a function with complex values and that eats complex numbers, such as a transfer function. Basically, the moment is just one of the coefficients of the Laurent series expansion of that function. So the Laurent series expansion is essentially what corresponds to Taylor series for complex functions, basically. And moments are just one of those coefficients, perhaps scaled by a given quantity.
So what advantage does model reduction via moment matching have over balancing? Or I guess, on the other hand, what are the disadvantages? How do they compare?
They're fundamentally different. So balancing has the very nice property that, it consists in computing the gradients of a certain system. The gradients essentially tell you what states are more, here I'm being very loose, obviously, but what states are more or less controllable. The observability gradient tells you what is more or less observable. And if you actually compute the product and you look at the singular values of this product, you're able essentially to simultaneously diagonalize, and that's what balancing does. And by truncating, if you want, in that new coordinate system, the singular values that correspond to the least observable and least controllable systems, the states, what you obtain is a reduced order model that has, first of all, a nice system theoretic interpretation. Second, it comes thanks to Keith Glover, another very illustrious figure on the subject of model reduction, with bounds on the approximation. So it actually respects some of the requirements that we mentioned before. The downside is that typically simultaneously diagonalizing those two matrices, so the two gradients, can be quite computationally intensive if you look at large-scale systems. And that actually is the motivation of model reduction, if you think about it. You normally want to approximate a system that is very large. These systems typically come maybe from the discretization of partial differential equations. The finer is your grid, the larger is the resulting linear time invariant system that you get.
If you would like to learn more about this particular approach to model order reduction, I mentioned before that this was covered in some detail in a previous episode of this podcast. So I'm going to link that in the description. I talked with Paolo Raposada for close to 10 minutes about model order reduction via balancing, including the differences between classical and Riccati balancing, balancing in the behavioral framework, and model reduction for dissipative systems.
So moment matching, in contrast, aside from having this interpretation of interpolation, so the approximation is exact at certain points, also is connected to, let's say, Krylov projectors. This is an extremely technical term, but it's just to say that the problem of computational tractability is somehow better handled by moment matching. The way one does it typically is it's possible to compute these Krylov projectors through, for example, Sylvester equations. So the solutions of these Sylvester equations provide you essentially a way of computing new reduced order models by projection. And projections are essentially cheap to compute.
Whilst I don't want to go into too much detail on all the technical concepts covered in this episode, I did want to mention Sylvester equations because this comes up a lot in Alberto's work and other areas of control. So, a Sylvester equation is a matrix equation in the form of AX plus XB equals C. And it turns out that Sylvester equations have a unique solution if and only if A and minus B don't have a common eigenvalue. So, as Alberto has just mentioned, you can use these Sylvester equations to construct projectors that define a reduced order model of a system. But there are also other ways that these equations can be used in control. And as I was researching this, I discovered that this specific type of Sylvester equation is actually part of a larger family of what are called generalized Sylvester equations. And these crop up all over the place in control. There's a very interesting book that goes into a lot of depth on these generalized Sylvester equations and their uses. But just to give you a little taste, so firstly, observer design can be converted into the problem of finding the solution of these types of equations, and the authors state that any kind of linear state observers for linear systems can be related to a certain type of generalized Sylvester equations. Secondly, the existence of solutions for model reference tracking and certain types of disturbance rejection problems can be framed in terms of first-order generalized Sylvester equations. And finally, the authors state that these kind of equations can be an effective approach to handling multi-objective control design problems. And they give an overview of kind of how you go about doing this and also some examples of where they've used this approach in their previous work. So that's hopefully given you a little insight into Sylvester equations. However, going back to model order reduction by moment matching, one of the questions that I had for Alberto was, are there any classes of systems where moment matching works better than balancing, or vice versa?
Well, it depends. I can think of systems that are more tractable for balancing in, for example, symmetric systems that have A equal to A transpose, B transpose equal to C, if we think about the usual ABCD representation. In that case, you don't have to diagonalize two gramions, but because of the symmetry, you only have one gramion, and so that's easier if you wish in that sense. I should say that what I worked on is not necessarily just the linear part, but actually the nonlinear part was the most interesting part. So if you wish, the master thesis that I developed was the appetizer, because the most interesting part was the use of differential geometric tools to actually reduce nonlinear systems. This can be done also for balancing. This is the work of Jacqueline Scherpen at Groningen University. But somehow I found more fascinating the approach of Alessandro Stolfi, my supervisor, and the use of certain tools in order to reduce systems through essentially the solution of partial differential equations.
So I guess going on to your PhD work, which is kind of related in some ways, I was going to ask how this came about. I guess you've already answered that a little bit, but was there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, first of all, there's two elements. First of all, I loved London when I was there. It's been an incredibly enriching experience, and I was a bit younger than I am now. And so I could do so many things that, I couldn't do back home. London, it was a huge metropolitan city. And I remember Alessandro telling me, living in London today is like living in Athens in, the golden age of Greek civilization. And I kind of agreed with that. So I couldn't help but staying. I had also a two-body problem, like many other researchers have, meaning that, my current wife, actually, at the time she was my girlfriend, also was looking for a PhD, and it was absolutely not a given that we would be able to live even in the same country. So we had been looking around. She did a master thesis and her Erasmus in Stockholm. So we did look in Stockholm, we did look in London, we also looked in Switzerland. And in the end, what worked out was to both conduct our PhD at Imperial College. So when we got the offer, we said yes.
So your PhD was titled Geometric Methods for Modelling and Approximation of Nonlinear Systems.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess kind of two parts of this question. So what appeals to you about nonlinear systems and why geometric methods?
It's impossible to resist the urge of being attracted by nonlinear systems. Nonlinear systems are so interesting because there are so many phenomena that do not exist in the linear world. I'm thinking of limit cycles. One can think about oscillations also for linear systems, but I'm thinking about limit cycles that one observes everywhere in reality, particularly limit cycles that somehow are generated by rhythms in biology. I guess we'll talk about it later as well. I've always been fascinated by the brain, and how the brain somehow manages. It's the best control system, right? It manages to control our body through signals that are essentially oscillating. And obviously, there are many other things that nonlinear systems theory was fascinating for me at the time. In particular, I came across this book after taking this course with Sandro Zampieri, written by my academic granddad, Alberto Isidori, who developed this theory of essentially, together with many others, of course, essentially replacing the concept of subspace with the concept of distribution. I mean, that was really the essence, together with, let's say, many other insights, of course, in developing this theory. Essentially, he was extending the already existing geometric control theory, linear geometric control theory, whereby, we would be obsessed, let's say, by subspaces, because subspaces are everywhere, reachable subspaces, for example, or other types of subspaces, with nonlinear equivalence. And the right tool, or the right lens, if you like, is differential geometry in order to do that. And differential geometry is just that branch of geometry that keeps on fascinating me, that deals with curved surfaces. It's been developed by Gauss, and it's still being used today, for example, in manifold optimization, but many other applications.
My next question is, how would you kind of define or characterize geometric control theory?
Geometric control, as I mentioned, looks at control through the lens of geometry. And it's impossible not to look at the world through the lens of geometry from my perspective, because it's intuitive, or at least it's more intuitive to me than equations. Geometric control was pioneered by others, actually. Not nonlinear geometric control theory was born to mimic, if you like, an already present theory developed by many. I can think about Murray Wonham, if I have to name one name, but also Basile and Marro in Italy. And in this theory, essentially, the language that one uses in order to describe systems and their properties, as I mentioned, is linear geometry and therefore linear algebra. So the queen place, if you want, is occupied by subspaces there. For example, reachable subspaces are what is often of interest to us. So where can I steer my system under suitable control actions? One can formulate a completely nonlinear analog of the concept by using distributions and foliations. Here I know that I'm throwing out grandiloquent terms, so maybe it's better to pause and let you guide the discussion.
Well, so my next question was going to be, again, I think you've kind of touched on this. So part of your master's thesis and your PhD involved extending concepts from the linear domain into the nonlinear domain. So why is something that kind of interests you is important? Why not develop things from scratch for the nonlinear systems?
So this is actually a reflection of, from my perspective at least, of what Alberto Padoan, together with many others, initiated. So they had something that worked in theory for linear systems, and they were concerned with the idea of understanding what is actually the same concept, but in a nonlinear world. And very often you would find that the best way to phrase what we think of being, the important object in the linear world is actually something else in a nonlinear world. One of my very small contributions was precisely that of thinking about what is a pole of a system for nonlinear systems. Typically, we think of poles of, I'll make this example very short. Typically, we think of poles of systems as essentially elements of C, the complex plane, or depending on how you want to call it, the complex field. Instead, I realized that in a nonlinear world, if you think about what a pole should be, you wouldn't be able to use this complex analytic approach to understanding what that concept means. But if you looked at, the same object with different eyes, you could formulate the same concept also for nonlinear systems. And in that case, for example, a pole could be simply thought of as a vector field, which could be a linear vector field, the matrix of which, whose eigenvalues, would be the actual poles, if that makes sense. I think you're completely right. Most of my PhD has been spent thinking about how to translate concepts that came from the linear world into the nonlinear world. It was always the same exercise, but I found it so fascinating.
I wanted to ask you about your view of control as a creative discipline. This is something you've kind of touched on in episodes of inControl. So kind of the creativity involved with coming up with new ideas and approaches, and how does this feed into your relationship with your work and research?
I think I'm very impressed by the fact that somehow, our disciplines, control engineering, like many others, or control theory, as you want to call it, is not classified as an art, in the sense that I find, as you say, the creative aspect of this discipline an art just as valuable as, creating a sculpture or a painting. And in fact, one of the things that I like to mention related to this subject is that, the time that you spend as a PhD student and then as a postdoc is really analogous to what other artists in the past would do for their academic lineages. I'm thinking of Michelangelo spending time with Ghirlandaio, Giotto with Cimabue. This is essentially a way of learning how others create, how to understand how to create, and then that helps you in developing your own creative style. Creativity is an extremely fascinating topic to me, and I keep reading books in my spare time about it. I feel that everybody should spend more time on that, on championing the inner artist that you have inside in this discipline, and not being afraid of being quote unquote yourself. So I don't know whether I addressed your question, but it's certainly something that is deeply fascinating for me.
I asked Alberto after the interview if there were any books in particular on creativity that he would recommend reading. He gave me a very detailed list, which I'm going to link below, but 2 works that I'd like to mention in particular. So firstly, a book called The Runaway Species by David Eagleman and Anthony Brandt, which explores different examples of human creativity and what they have in common. I'm currently halfway through listening to the audiobook version and very much enjoying it. Secondly, Alberto recommended the letters and interviews of Ernest Hemingway, which led me down a bit of a rabbit hole reading a ton of quotes from him. Some of them were great, but maybe less suitable for broadcasting on an academic podcast. But one that I did want to share with you, which I absolutely loved, was, "When you stop doing things for fun, you might as well be dead," which I think that's quite true. Remember to have fun with the things you're working on.
So a lot of your work, and especially the geometric aspects, I was wondering, how much of this do you understand intuitively versus sitting down with the equations, and how much kind of seemingly abstract mathematics is it possible to visualize?
Most of my thinking is visual, and I am an extremely visual animal as opposed to others, at least in our field. And that's why I'm so obsessed by geometry, because it's one of the few things that I do understand, actually. And I guess it's one of the defining threads also of my academic journey. Like in looking at my publications before coming into this room, I realized that geometry is really what is guiding my thinking throughout, from the beginning and until today. Initially via differential geometry in the context of nonlinear control, and then nonlinear system theory, biological applications. And nowadays that I shifted my interests a bit more to other subjects like data-driven control, I still have this very geometric understanding of behaviors. I guess we're going to talk about it later. I know that you talked about it also with Paolo Rapisarda in one of the past episodes. The shape of dynamics, as I call it, is something that helps me conceptualize ideas better than equations.
Okay, so you have a really great diagram at the start of your thesis that guides the reader through all the different parts of your PhD. So the 2 main tools that you used were moments and geometry. So I guess it kind of makes sense to start with moments, because we talked a bit about that in your master's thesis. So chapter 4 of your PhD focused on the notion of a pole and extending this to nonlinear systems. So I guess we have kind of discussed this a bit already. So why did the classical notion of moments of systems not apply at the poles, and how did you get around this?
Sure. This is, I would say, a technicality, but it's an interesting one in the sense that, so when we define moments classically in the context of model reduction, as I mentioned, we consider coefficients of a Lorentz series expansion of the transfer function. And we kind of take it for granted that this transfer function is evaluated around a point that is not a pole, but there are specific points, as we know, in the complex plane, whereby there are literally singularities for the transfer function. That means that if you take the limit as s, the complex variable, approaches one of those poles, your transfer function blows up. And I'm not sure why the concept of moment was not defined until then around poles, but I realized in talking to my supervisor, Alessandro, that coefficients of Lorentz series expansions are still well defined around poles. It's just that you have to take negative coefficients, so coefficients that go, let's say, backwards with respect to the usual ordering of natural numbers up to a certain point. And so we said, okay, for linear systems, we can define this notion, and we found ways of extending the framework of model reduction by moment matching developed by Alessandro. But of course, the guiding question was that how do we extend this notion to nonlinear systems, and how can we exploit it? And maybe as I touched on before, like tangentially, it's possible to extend the notion of pole, and in my view also of eigenvalue, or at least I tried to propose one, but it's one of the many, to nonlinear systems, thinking about in a different way, thinking about poles in a different way. So poles can be also thought of as the eigenvalues of, let's say, the matrix A that defines the dynamics of a linear system. The matrix A times X, the state variable in turn, can be thought of as a vector field, a linear vector field. So I thought, okay, if I think about poles as related to the vector field itself, maybe I can define a notion of pole for nonlinear systems. And in fact, that's what we did.
So your work examined model reduction via moment matching from both a kind of complex analytic and geometric perspective. So why was it important or interesting to examine the same problem from different perspectives, and did this give any extra insight?
Yeah, it was crucial. It was crucial because, first of all, the complex analytic perspective was the most natural one, simply because, as I mentioned, the notion of pole is defined for complex valued functions. So that was a necessary step in order to understand how to translate this concept in geometric world. And then what we did after that paper, which I think was published at IFAC at some point, we thought about, okay, how do we extend it to the nonlinear world and using this geometric perspective? And the geometric perspective essentially allowed us to think of poles, as I mentioned, as vector fields that are somehow, in a sense, quote unquote, smaller and related to an equivalent notion of subspace. In that case, I believe distributions, well, invariant manifolds rather than distributions. And that was really the crux of trying to translate this concept.
Alberto has mentioned manifolds and distributions a few times in this episode, so I wanted to add a little bit of background for anyone who's not familiar with topology. So, formally, a manifold is a topological space that locally resembles Euclidean space. So a 2D manifold is a shape that when you zoom in far enough, the surface looks flat. More specifically, a 2D manifold is a closed 2D surface that doesn't self-intersect. So for example, a sphere and a torus are both examples of 2D manifolds. And another example you might have heard of is a Klein bottle. So this is an example of a 2D manifold that only exists in 4 dimensions. And whilst making this episode, I remembered a number file video that I'd watched years ago on Klein bottles. So I went back and watched it. And this is maybe the best thing that I've seen all year. So the guy in this video, Cliff Stoll, gets so excited about Klein bottles is actually my favourite thing. So I edited together my favourite audio segments of the video that I'm going to play for you now, just so you can get a feel for how much Cliff loves Klein bottles.
Well, the cool thing about a Mobius loop, and there's about 50 or 60 cool things about a Mobius loop.
Just for context, you can construct a Klein bottle by stitching together 2 Mobius loops.
In a quality universe that has 4 spatial dimensions, Klein bottles would be terrific. Look, look, look. Friend of mine, Robert Lang, made a paper origami Klein bottle. I mean, absolutely sweet. 1 sheet of paper, it's an origami Klein bottle. So I had to put 1,000 Klein bottles someplace, so I put them under my house.
I've linked the video in the description. I would highly recommend watching the full thing. There's also a different video where he shows off the little Klein bottle retrieval robot that he's made to move around the Klein bottle storage facility under his house. I love him so much. So, that's a manifold. What is meant by a distribution in this context? Now, there are a lot of different uses of the term distribution in maths. So what Alberto is referring to here is not what you're probably familiar with, which is a distribution in the context of probability. Instead, this kind of distribution is related to spans of vector fields, and it gives a way of assigning points on the manifold to a vector subspace. So if you're interested in learning more, I've left links to interesting things to go and read in the description. So that's just been a very brief introduction to manifolds and distributions, and we're now going to return to Alberto's work on model reduction via moment matching.
Okay, I'm not sure how much you want to add to what you said already, but in terms of kind of extending these ideas to nonlinear systems, could you give a sense of how that works?
Not sure what I can add in this respect, but what I can add maybe is a funny story. So I spent a lot of time on problem of moment matching, but the original idea for my PhD, and this is, I hope, a message of hope for all other PhD students that may listen to this episode, is that my PhD was related to something entirely different. The ambition was that of translating, again, from the linear world to the nonlinear world, a way of doing system identification, so essentially estimating, if you like, a model of a nonlinear system to the nonlinear world. And in particular, the methods we were looking at were subspace methods. So in system identification, we typically have these two ways of doing things. I guess throughout my life, I had a duality between two ways of doing things, academic life. One is prediction error methods. So prediction error methods essentially postulate that there exists a parametric model, let's say a transfer function with coefficients that you have to find, and then focuses on finding these parameters. Whereas subspace identification methods exploit the assumption that the underlying system is linear in order to identify, if you like, certain subspaces and construct system matrices from those subspaces. Both of these have advantages and disadvantages, but the latter had this, again, geometric interpretation. And so the intuition was that it lent itself better to being translated in the nonlinear world. It's incredible to think that I still think about that problem today. And, you know, I feel that I'm sometimes making tiny progress in that direction. And I actually hope to go back to it at some point.
So I would very briefly like to discuss your work on moments of random variables and then kind of return to model reduction.
Sure.
So chapter 7 of your thesis was relating moments to probability theory and the notion of moments of random variables. So what is the link between probability and systems theory? Why is this interesting or useful?
Oh, this is a big topic. We could talk for hours. I could say that, you know, in that specific publication, the question was looking at a very specific problem. And the problem was there are notions of moments also in the context of probability theory. Moments are essentially, again, some sort of Taylor expansion, but now of the probabilistic description of a random variable. And the curiosity there was to understand what is the connection, if there is any, between that notion of moment, so the probabilistic one, and the system theoretic one. And the realization there was the fact that under some assumptions, so under the assumption that certain probability densities are interpreted as impulse responses of a system, you can actually draw a connection. And the connection has lots of, let's say, curiosities related to it. I forget now what we did apply the theory to, but I remember thinking about queuing systems, for example. I remember thinking about Markov chains, and yeah, the fact that these two notions are related.
I wanted to quickly highlight here the paper that Alberto wrote on this topic titled Moments of Random Variables, a System Theoretic Interpretation, because as well as being extremely interesting in its own right, the introduction to this paper gives a super interesting review of moments in probability and where they're useful, as well as previous research into the crossover between probability theory and systems theory. And Alberto also pointed out in this paper that the Kalman filter is a key example of exchange of ideas between systems theory and probability, which is kind of obvious when you think about it, but I don't think I really ever had.
So did your kind of work in this area help you to better understand statistics or probability? And are there any problems in probability theory you think could benefit from the link to systems theory?
Yeah, plenty. I mean, I'm thinking about it these days, still with a student that I would like to mention, Andras Shashvi. So probability theory is obviously one of the deepest theories that has been developed in the past century. I would say the most interesting question to me, and some may disagree with my opinion, is that behavioral systems theory still is in its infancy in the context of stochastic systems. This is an extremely hot take, if you wish. So I expect some backlash from the audience. But I don't think it's a coincidence that Jan Willems, the main developer of the pioneer, if you like, of behavioral systems theory, thought about this issue in the last phases of his life, thinking about what is a behavior from defining what is a behavior from a stochastic perspective is difficult. So this is, let's say, one of the most interesting questions.
So going back to the problem of model reduction. So since your PhD, you've written a few papers on model reduction for dominant systems that I found really interesting. So what are dominant systems and how did you first get interested in this area?
Okay, I can probably provide a bit of context for this topic. I think it's needed. As I mentioned, I was always, I should provide context for the context. So context for the context is that when I was about to apply for university, I wanted to do either mathematics or philosophy, but that was off the table due to financial constraints at home. So I looked at more quote unquote realistic jobs, or jobs that would lead to immediate employment after discussions with my family. And I decided that, the most interesting things for me were either medicine or engineering. Engineering because it would be the most mathematical one, and medicine because, you would learn how the body functions. And then I realized that I couldn't stand the sight of blood, so it was an easy choice. But I got into biomedical engineering. Biomedical engineering because I was fascinated by the fact that you could somehow engineer the body or extensions of the body through, mathematical thinking in a certain way. So I've always been fascinated. This is context for the context. I've always been fascinated by biological applications. And let's say context for me to joining the University of Cambridge is that, I am, maybe it's 2017, 2018. I'm on the job market. I want to find a postdoc in order to continue my academic career. I have no doubts about continuing. And I was looking around. My, at the time, girlfriend or partner found a very good job in London. So there was certainly an incentive in staying. And so I was looking at the most obvious places, Oxford, Cambridge. And it just so happened that precisely that year, or maybe a year before, Rodolphe Sepulcre had moved from, I believe, Belgium to the UK. And he gave a lecture about using nonlinear control to understand neuronal dynamics. I remember very vividly the lecture he gave because it was extremely fascinating and certainly less mathematical, but more at the conceptual level, if you like. Very scientific in the sense that he generally wanted to understand how neurons worked in the brain, as I mentioned also at the beginning. But I must say I did not understand a single word of what he said. Anyhow, this was fascinating for me, and connecting back to the moment where I was searching for a job, he was the most obvious suspect to contact. So I talked to Alessandro, and Alessandro suggested, he's an eminent researcher in the field of nonlinear control. He had done a lot already by then. So I said, why not? So I go for, I think, we first met at a conference. We had a chat. And we were talking about, my work and his interests. And then I go for an actual interview at Cambridge in his office. It lasted 1 hour. I was extremely nervous. And all we talked about was philosophy, basically. 1 hour of philosophy and, Jan Willem's dissipativity, and why is it interesting to study nonlinear behaviors defined by neuronal dynamics. So it was a match. And I was hooked, and I got, I guess, the offer maybe the same night, or if not, or the day after, and I immediately said yes. It worked perfectly because Cambridge is only an hour away from London, so I could actually, stay with my partner and also do some research that I liked. And that's how the start of my research in the dominance theory, what Fulvio Forni and Rodolphe Sepulcre, the two main developers, call it. That's how it started, basically.
If you'd like to learn more about Rodolphe Sepulcre's work, you can go and listen to the inControl episode that Alberto made with him a few years ago, which I found extremely interesting. I am also going to link in the description a paper that Rodolphe wrote on spiking control, which I very much enjoyed reading.
I can tell you what a dominant system is, or the concept at least. And again, I guess we have to provide some context for that too. So again, here the motivation is that if you look around in biology, the way decisions are made and the way control happens is done through essentially two types of quote-unquote behaviors. One type of behavior is switches. You can literally think of an electrical switch, so something that is either on or off. And this is how one would essentially determine whether you choose, let's say, black or white, going left or right, 0 or 1. That would be the analogy of a switch. And clocks instead is how we measure time. So somehow incredibly, biology is capable of measuring time without having an internal clock. This is one of the most fascinating things. I mean, if you're not fascinated by this, there is a problem. Circadian rhythm, we know that circadian rhythms exist. This has been studied to death in biology. We know that these are actually quite robust behaviors that are certainly enforced by our interaction with the sun, but do not require it. So there are experiments of people being locked in caves for up to 1 month, and where we observe that the drift of these biological rhythms is actually not very substantial. So the stability, if you like, of these behaviors is remarkable, and it's done in an extremely energy efficient way and with components that are quote unquote cheap and not particularly well tuned. So this is really the grand vision, the grand why we would like to study these behaviors.
Whilst on the topic of circadian rhythms, a few months ago I recorded an episode with Matthias Fu in which we discussed his research looking at how to control and regulate circadian rhythms in the presence of disturbances, for example, those caused by pathogen infection. So if you're interested in practical control of biochemical systems, you might enjoy giving that a listen. But Alberto's work is more to do with understanding how switching and oscillating behaviours seen in biological systems occur from a theoretical viewpoint, and also how to construct reduced order models of these systems that still exhibit the same underlying properties.
And dominance theory comes to the rescue there, trying to apply another big theory that comes from systems and control, namely dissipativity theory, in order to analyze and design those behaviors. So trying to either enforce them by design, through the design of controllers, or at least certify that they exist. For example, when you interconnect certain systems.
So could you explain the approach that you took to model reduction of dominant systems? Because I understand this didn't involve the moment matching approach you used previously.
No, not at all. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, balancing, so model reduction by balancing, is related to Lyapunov methods. The reason is that Gramians themselves are positive symmetric matrices, positive semi-definite in principle, positive definite under some assumptions. And these objects essentially define bilinear forms, quadratic forms, that can be interpreted as Lyapunov functions. Lyapunov functions, as we know, are quite important in our field. They tell us a lot about stability of a system. And it turns out that these Gramians can be determined through the solution of a Lyapunov equation. Dominance, in turn, as I mentioned, essentially builds on the notion of Lyapunov stability and dissipativity theory in a very specific way. So, dissipativity theory, as you also discussed already with Paolo Rapisarda in a previous episode, adds inputs and outputs to the theory of Lyapunov, stability theory of Lyapunov. And dominance theory asks the question of what happens when we fictitiously, I hope I'm not doing injustice to Fulvio, Forni and Rodolph, but ask the question, rather than focusing on behaviors that are in a certain sense linear or rather stable, rather than focusing on asymptotic stability, what can we say when we interconnect two systems and generate a switch mechanism or an oscillation? And it turns out that if you look at the necessarily nonlinear systems that generate these behaviors, if you look at the Jacobian of the vector field that governs the dynamics of the system, you can learn a lot. To make an intuitive analogy, one can look at the poles again of the Jacobian and look at how they move as we move along the state space. So we look at the linearization everywhere. And it turns out that under some assumptions, if you have a certain number of poles beyond a fictitious imaginary axis to the right of this imaginary axis, we have this property that is called dominant. The poles being to the right of this axis are a necessary condition, but not sufficient. Dominance is actually defined by a Lyapunov equation itself. So the connection between these Lyapunov-like equations and Gramians was somewhat obvious. It was obvious that it was possible to develop tools that would allow us to preserve these behaviors. So the question there would be, Let's say that I start from a large-scale, possibly large-scale biological system that has oscillations, that generates oscillations or switching behaviors. There's plenty in the mathematical biology literature. I guess the one that I remember studying was the Goldbetter model for the generation of circadian rhythms in the fruit fly, but also the Goodwin model, which is another classical model of for the generation of oscillations in biological systems. We were asking the question, suppose that these systems are large, how do I reduce them so as to preserve the original oscillating behavior, and ideally in a way that the oscillations are also close? And so what we did was to develop a method that essentially, again, fictitiously shifted this imaginary axis to the left in order to look at these dominance properties. And we reduced those gramians rather than the classical ones instead. And what we observed was that we obtained exactly what we wanted. So we were reducing, in terms of complexity, the differential equation that was describing the original system, so in terms of order, while retaining the original behavior, which was very fascinating.
Okay, just while we're on the topic of dominant systems, I wanted to ask you about a paper you wrote on dominance margins, just because I thought that was really interesting. So kind of, what are dominance margins? How did that paper come about?
And this goes, it's essentially related to the same idea. So rather than focusing on stability, so stability here intended in the sense of Lyapunov and in particular of asymptotic stability, we were interested in these quote-unquote dominance properties, dominance being intended as necessary condition to see switch-like or oscillatory-like oscillations. And so the perspective there was, again, if you imagine evaluating, so typically what we use in order to characterize behaviors of linear systems is we use Bode diagrams and Nyquist diagrams, and they allow us to say something about the stability in closed loop of a linear system. And the way you define the Nyquist diagram is by evaluating a transfer function along a very specific axis in the complex plane, the imaginary axis. And, through the interaction with Rodolphe and Fulvio at the University of Cambridge, I realized that, there's many axes that one can choose, or even different strips, if you want, in the complex plane over which one can evaluate the transfer function. And what turns out is that if you shift this axis left or right, left in that case, it is possible, again, under some assumptions, to say something about the margin, but margin in the sense of, I was thinking of stability, an analogy of stability margins for these nonlinear behaviors. So margins here are intended, for example, as distance to the critical point. So the distance to the critical point being -1 in the complex plane between the Nyquist diagram and this point, gives you a sense of how far are you from instability under feedback. Similarly, if you evaluate these transfer functions along different axes, you get a sense of how far you are from disrupting this behavior, this either oscillatory or switch-like behavior under feedback. So it's a really beautiful analogy that I still find very fruitful. So people should, again, not necessarily read my papers, but read the original dominance paper. Is extremely fascinating.
I have a few kind of quick-fire questions at the end, if that's
Sure.
all right. So first one, which I guess you asked your guests as well, so I'm going to ask you, is kind of advice to current PhD students or future generations.
Ooh, it's kind of difficult to be on the other side. I should have thought about this. Based on personal experience, there's one thing, I'm not sure whether it's been mentioned already by other guests on my show, but I think there's an extreme value in seeing the world from a different perspective. And you can achieve, this kind of sensation in different ways, particularly in academia. One way is to obviously travel, meet different cultures, ideally live in a different country. That's certainly useful. But again, another way of achieving this is, for example, considering a postdoc. I know that some people in our field consider postdocs almost negative because, you're not getting closer to becoming a professor sooner. And, sooner is better in this world in some sense. But I believe that that's not necessarily true. This is I should give credit to Fulvio Forni for this. I remember he was mentoring me when I was in Cambridge, and some advice he gave me at the time was that, once you become a professor, you get the keys of your office, and that's going to be your office for a long while, typically, and that's it. You don't get that opportunity of being mentored by someone who has more experience and may see the world from a different lens. So I would kind of counter, the general folklore that the sooner you get to professorship, the better, but actually encourage people to go for a postdoc, try to actually challenge every dogma that you might have inside, remove it, because that actually forces you to find yourself, to find your inner researcher, and basically shapes your own identity, makes you stronger.
Are there any fields of control you haven't worked in yet but would like to?
Oof, too many. Too many. There are so many questions that are interesting, and the fun fact is that those that I find interesting are those that are in the past, or that were fashionable in the past in a certain sense. The reason why I say this is that there are many questions that have been addressed in the past and that to my eyes have not been fully answered. One question, for example, that I continue to be fascinated by is adaptation. Clearly in our body, or in every biological system, and as I say, biological systems are a big source of fascination for me, adaptation is present. There's no survival without adaptation. And, adaptive control has led to extremely fruitful developments in the past, but I believe that the final word has not been said on the subject. Another subject that I find extremely fascinating, and I don't know whether I've been brainwashed by John Doyle, is the question of architecture. The question of architecture is a very interesting one from a systems theoretic perspective rather than a control theoretic perspective. So how do you design an architecture, loosely speaking? This is manifested, to my eyes at least, in machine learning today. Machine learning, I know that this is another extremely hot take, and I know that some people may disagree with what I say, but I see a lot of pepper and salt in how we build machine learning architectures today. I take maybe a softmax here, and then I'll wrap around a transformer or an attention block, and then I'll assemble that into many more other layers. And the result is typically measured by a table with accuracies and performance. But as a theorist, that's deeply unsatisfying. I would like to know a priori what is the best architecture, what is the best block that I can use to compose one of these, say, neural networks of machine learning models, and certify a priori that this is the best I can do. This is the best I can do, maybe using certain blocks. I know that there are some people, one in particular that I can mention is Joele Zardini at MIT, Alberto Sangiovanni-Vincentelli, with a different language in the past that I also had on the show at some point, working with the language of category theory to say something about this topic. Again, I believe that this is just the beginning. John Doyle, obviously, another person who has worked on this topic. I think we're still far from, first of all, defining what is an architecture. We know what are the important elements of that, but also understanding how to optimize architectures. That's a very interesting question for me.
That's all from this month's episode. So just to summarise a few key points from the discussion so far. Firstly, the moments of a system are given by the coefficients of its Lorentz series expansion, and these give a neat way of carrying out model order reduction, which often has the advantage of being less computationally intensive than model order reduction via balancing. Secondly, there's a neat link between the moments of systems and the moments of random variables that may give some insight into how to define a behaviour from a stochastic perspective, as well as a lot of other interesting problems. Geometric control allows for a more intuitive understanding of systems, and many aspects of geometric control in the linear setting can be extended to nonlinear systems. So, for example, the pole of a nonlinear system takes the form of a vector field satisfying certain properties, And finally, dominance theory gives insight into interesting biological phenomena such as circadian cycles, and it applies dissipativity theory to understand how these arise and how to design controllers to mimic this behaviour. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to follow the podcast or connect with me on LinkedIn, and like and subscribe if you did enjoy the episode. So part 2 with my discussion with Alberto will be released on the 1st of October, and we'll be discussing a ton of more interesting things. So a lot of really cool technical stuff, including persistence of excitation in a non-linear context and how to define distances within a behavioural systems framework. There was one paper in particular that I legitimately got so excited when I was reading it, I started jumping up and down in my office. So look forward to that. And we also discuss the origins of the inControl podcast, as well as future episodes that Alberto would love to make. So very exciting. But until then, I hope you have a wonderful month.